Yes, we are so delighted to have Father Flanagan back with us again. And I reviewed the history on May 1st, 2020. He came and talked to us about suicide. He's been working for the last 10 years with the AFP. What is it? Can you tell me?
American Foundation for Suicide Prevention.
For suicide prevention, right?
Yeah.
And at the time, one of the reasons we wanted that workshop was because I had somebody in my congregation who had lost two family members, and then with the pandemic coming on, really was suicidal. And I was so grateful for the session that he did with us on May 1st, 2020. This guy's still alive. So I'm grateful to God for just little suggestions about how, as a priest, to do the gentle things that can actually really make a difference, and be ready to do the hard things as needed. He also was part of a sessions we did on the soul cried from the abyss, biblical, theological, and practical resources for preventing and grieving suicide. That was on January 5th, 2021. And, again, fabulous material. What you should know about Father Flanagan is he's got a great website. If you don't have one, you might want to check it out. At age 37, he began his Master in Divinity degree at Virginia Theological Seminary in Alexandria, Virginia. And it's interesting because I think I was 37 when I started my work at Harvard Divinity School. And I think for a number of us that midlife crisis hits hard. In 2018, he completed his Doctor of Ministry degree at VTS, specializing in Christian spirituality. And he's now an adjunct faculty member at General Theological Seminary, and he teaches in the area of Christian spirituality, pastoral theology, and ministry and evangelism. And I want to point out his books, which I think will be very interesting to you. The most recent one is Courage to Thrive, which is a fabulous topic. And he's got another one, Growing a Soul. And he's writing a novel that the plot is fabulous, When the Coyotes Howl. And I hope he rewrites it fast so that we get to read it soon. So, Father Flanagan, thank you so much for leading our discussion today.
Thanks, Victoria. I'm pleased to be with you all. Let's begin. I'm going to just change one or two things here as we start. That should help me. There we go. So as we begin, but let me try to get this right. I'm getting my slideshow up, so let's just do that. There we go. And y'all can see it, and we can start it so we don't have all the other bits. There we go. So good morning, everybody. Thank you for being with me. We're going to walk through portions of the book of Ezra, really chapters 1 through 6, and we're going to pick off a certain number of verses, as you can see. We'll try not to cover too much ground. I'm going to give you a light background on the setting of Ezra, just so you have it if you haven't read it in a while, and we can move from that to basically a summary of the theology. Then we'll move through the verses and come to a conclusion. What I'm hoping we can do is during this is make this interactive. I mean, we've all done so many Zooms at this point. I was so surprised when we heard May 1, 2020, that this is the first time I was welcomed in with this group, and to be back a year later and still, dealing as we are, is surprising and on a lot of emotional levels. So, but I'm glad to be here and be able to share this with you. So the book of Ezra is from the 6th century BCE. So about the year 538, 539, as we think is the beginning of the tie down date It is a story of return to Jerusalem from the exiled Judahites, and they were exiled in Babylon and Susa, and so on their way back. Placing this canonically within the Old Testament, this is at the very end of the historical narrative, so and what's included in our canon historically. So you just get a framework of where this is. Interestingly, it's Yahweh that stirs the spirits of King Cyrus of Persia, and it's him who permits the Judahites to return to Jerusalem and orders them to rebuild the temple. So it's about the restoration of Jerusalem and Judah, and it comes in a context of socially, religiously, and physically of this return. So it's return on many different levels. I think I would also argue to say that it's an emotional return as well. They're going to face various opponents along the way. So that gives us the framework of what we're facing and where we're going with this. The theology is quite, in some ways, kind of simple but profound. The book of Ezra, and we can look at Esdras in the apocryphal literature, but also Nehemiah as the companion to this book. But Ezra in particular is a story of God's involvement with his people. Questions I wanted to consider for today is does this story hold true for Christians? And in what way? If so, I'm going to argue it does. And I also going to argue that this story can help us today. Commentary, just so you have it, I really drew from one commentary. There's so many to draw from, but this is a recent one, so I thought it would be interesting. Pretty readable. I don't always agree with, as none of us should, with what the authors say, but Shepherd and Wright give us a pretty close reading of the text. So it's all, in my opinion, it's all good. So verse 1, and if you want to have your Bibles out, that's fine. If not, I put the scripture that we're going to cover, and I'll give you the story as we go along. So I can give you some of the background, but if you want to tick along with the Bible, it's fine. So I'll start off with just reading these. In the first year of King Cyrus of Persia, in order, I'm going to have to change my where you all are located. I can't read. My grid is in the wrong place. Let's try this. Okay. In order that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be accomplished, the Lord stirred up the spirit of King Cyrus of Persia so that he sent a herald throughout the kingdom. The herald is going to announce the work of God, and the herald is going to spread the word that the Judahites can return to their Jerusalem and the towns and villages around Judah. So I think it's important for us to remember, and I think the really good lesson that we have here is that God's involvement in the world is expansive, meaning he just doesn't work with the prophets. He just doesn't work with the Israelites or just one person or in one limited way. God's work is surprising, moving the powers that be to make a change, and it can be unexpected, working with King Cyrus, a Persian, not a Jew, to have the Jewish people return. Think of this as reflection of how different that is in that way from what Moses did and his confrontation. This has a surprising and different way of working that. So my first question, I really would like to throw it out and love to hear. We have time enough to hear us, for us to share, and I think the group is a good size. So I would ask this question: how have you seen God at work in surprising ways recently? And we could think about that for a minute, but if somebody would like to give a reflection on their thoughts, let's jump into it. Yeah, Vicky, you're going to share with us?
Yes,
I'm just trying to make sure. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, I don't quite trust this.
There's someone else who wants to
better
share.
than nothing. I continue to be surprised, and very recently, just in this last week, um, by the outreach that live streaming Sunday services has created. And recently was contacted by a couple who have now joined the parish because they found our Facebook stream. And they're coming to us from a different denomination, and there's a whole backstory there. But the surprising hand of God piece for me is that their shopping for a new spiritual home came to its conclusion by the use of Facebook and live streaming and Sunday Mass on stream. So it has brought a new joy for me and for several of us.
Yeah, it's beautiful. That's beautiful.
Mysterious ways.
Yeah, isn't it? Yeah. Victoria, were you gonna?
Yes, I was. And, a similar thing, which is as surprising to me, is one of my cousins has just contracted a very serious form of cancer in her bile ducts. And, then found our services again, live streaming online. And so I've got cousins that are listening to me who never could have before. And we all come from we're all PKs, preachers' kids or theological offspring. And of course, all of our fathers have died. But it was very touching to reconnect that way. And it's been quite surprising. And I just want to say also the ways in which prayer has grown in a different way. And there are a number of people in our congregation with cancer, and also we've had people with COVID, but it has felt like somehow the prayer network has gotten stronger. So I just lift that up. The combination of live streaming and phone calls and emails, but I'm grateful to God for those powerful connections and the gift of seeing someone who had a life expectancy that was far shorter, and she has survived beyond what was thought, and that's just thrilling. That's really thrilling. So
yeah,
God.
Exactly. Yeah. Other shares?
Yeah, this is Gareth Evans, and I was just thinking about how many angels can you get on the head of a needle as a sort of entree into the whole vaccination process here in New York. And I've been surprised that in many ways, Andrew Cuomo has been our King Cyrus of Persia, that God has worked through him. And the nation was gripped by his capacity to create a narrative that made sense around the vaccine rollout. And then here in New York, we've been gripped lately by certain revelations about his personal life. And as clergy, we were also somewhat caught on the back foot that we were not included in the group of that could receive the vaccine, not at the head of the queue, but certainly in what we would have considered to be a pastorally more appropriate way, because we have pastoral care needs that we cannot meet unless we're vaccinated. So just reflecting on the mixed experience of being under King Cyrus of Persia, I've been surprised and appalled, and I've been surprised and heartened at the same time. So, how does God work through secular government, quote unquote, in this time of great need?
Right. And I think we'll see that as we the book of Ezra gives us some of that as the people arrive in Jerusalem and then have to re-engage with Cyrus or others along the kings of Persia during this time of return. So I appreciate that. Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Yeah. Other thoughts before we move to the next slide? If anyone has anything they want to share, and if not, we can come back. But but let's move on. So verse 1:5 reads, the heads of the family of Judah and Benjamin. Let me do this. There we go. Heads of the family of Judah and Benjamin, and the priests and Levites, everyone whose spirit God had stirred, got ready to go up and rebuild the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. And from the commentary, the mechanics and means of redemption are explained not in economic, social, or political terms, but in spiritual ones. That's important for us to remember. It is God's Spirit who stirs the powers that be of the earth and his own people into action, and does so for one purpose, so that worship of him may be restored. What I would point out within that, this part of the reading is everyone whose spirit God had stirred up. So God is the actor. It's God's actions. It's not everyone's spirit, but it's everyone's spirit who God had stirred up. So there was, importantly, spiritual encouragement was fortified for the return, or fortified the return. But not everybody's spirit was returned. Not all returned. Some chose not to, and others physically couldn't. To remember that. So there was a diaspora that remained in Babylon for a variety of reasons. Some couldn't physically or emotionally make the trip. It was a long trip, and others just said, "I'm prosperous here, and I'm going to stay here." So I would ask is how or have you considered who might not return to church and why? Out of your congregation, are there folks that you would have you thought about that, and what would that mean? I'm happy to warm it up a little bit as we're thinking about it. I've been an interim.
The first thing that
yeah, go ahead, Mary. Yeah, no, I'd rather hear from you.
The first thing that occurs to me is that some people won't be able to return because they have died, whether it's from COVID or from other reasons that we've been away for so long. And those transitions have not been marked in any way.
I think that's profound, isn't it? And I think Ezra will give us perhaps some ways to think about that as well. I appreciate that. Oops. There I am. My Zoom skills are a little rusty here for some reason. I was as interim for the past 7 years at 7 different churches, yes. And my most recent one was, I spent most of COVID, with exception of about 8 weeks, was all during COVID. And so the challenge was, we opened the doors in the summer thinking, well, okay, lots of people will return, but we never got above 50% of our allowable capacity. It's kind of considering all of who might and might not return to church, and for whatever reasons, it's worth for us to consider, I think, in this. Do others want to add a thought or two?
Yeah, when you ask the question, faces began to roll through my imagination. First, like Mary mentioned, those who have passed, and we haven't been able to properly mourn. But then members of the congregation who I know have significant ailments and have trouble getting out even under normal circumstances. We may never see them again, but physically present in church. And other members of the congregation who have reason to be even more concerned about COVID exposure than the rest of us, and even with vaccinations, may choose to be may choose to stay home for an extended period of time afterwards, simply because the high risk of exposure and complications. I'm thinking of one woman in particular who had a very bad case of Lyme disease, and it's left her health very delicate and she has to monitor herself very carefully. And even after she's vaccinated, she may decide that even catching a mild case is not worth much risk, and will possibly continue to be a remote participant for some time.
Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. And any other thoughts or any other comments? I think both Mary's and Vic's were really good.
Yes, Tori.
Yeah.
Thanks. It's Tori Duncan.
Oh, thanks, Tori. Yeah, I can't see everybody all at once. So jump right in.
Well, I'm very grateful for you leading this for us, Bob. I've thought a lot about the people who are excited about returning and those who I think that all of the categories of people that have been named are absolutely true in my experience. There's another category or even two, depending on how fine you want to divide it, the people who choose not to, the people who have gotten comfortable. Some people have laughed and said, you know, why would I get out of my pajamas on Sunday mornings? And then there's another category, I think, that's similar. People who are actually now afraid to be with other people. That may change with time, may not. But I think that we're in sort of the idea of the congregational development circles of, you know, your core all the way out to your peripheral. I think that our peripheral is going to increase significantly from people who are stepping out a little bit away from the physical contact, and probably also from those people who are stepping in a little bit. But I do think that some people who came to church maybe once a month or maybe even twice a month might not. And that, I don't know, I go between being concerned about that and wondering if that's just part of the flow. So that's my thought.
Right. Or maybe all the extroverts will want to get back and find every single way they can relate to people.
That's probably very true.
I also feel like the definition of coming back is a little slippery, because some people who had moved geographically away from the area have come back to the virtual space, and some people who were previously considered homebound or too ill to come in are now coming virtually. So didn't they actually come back? And our definitions of who's in have changed.
Right. Yeah. Go ahead.
Really,
that
makes a lot of sense, because I haven't been able to do home communions for a long time for various reasons, and yet that homebound population are really engaged with church again, and they feel like they're back in the sanctuary. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of the yin and yang of that reality, that they were actually in privatized piety and now they're not, and yet they haven't seen their priest and they haven't received communion for a long time. So I really do appreciate the subtleties of what we're sort of thinking about here. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. So the hybrid model, as we say, is here to stay. At least from a pastoral perspective, it should be here to stay.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting, right, Victor?
There have been some conflicting, I think, the conflicting relationship with God at this moment have been kind of brought to the surface. So like, you know, why are we going through this? And what do we do wrong? And all of this is kind of putting people as well at that moment just of questioning communion with other people, you know, like, how do we do this again in a different way? How do we continue with this in a religious setting? And if I am okay right now with my personal spiritual practice, why do I want to change this at this moment? And it's working for me. The other part I think that is coming up again in this question is that we always thought the people that would need to connect with the virtual, like the online world, would be younger families. And we have seen now that many of those ones who are connecting to our online lives are mainly baby boomers, people who wanted to be connected in ways that we never thought of that it could be possible. Right now, they are the ones attending services, sending out their contributions and things like that are keeping the church moving in some way. So it's a time where many of the preconceived ideas are being challenged, and that returning, like reconnecting with our physical structures and buildings, it's questioned as well. So so there's a lot of questions that come to mind right there.
Right. Well, let's push a little farther into chapter 3 here.
Well, I think Michelle wanted to share
Michelle,
something.
did you want to say something?
Well, I just been observing that, especially because I was sick last month, and I watched the community in various stages of anxiety around my sickness with COVID, and what strikes me is that, regardless of the logic of it being safe for us to be together, this has been such an emotional roller coaster that the emotion is leading right now, and it will continue to lead, and it will continue to control how we interact socially for a long time to come, because the emotional piece is largely unconscious for so many people. And I mean, I noticed it myself when I watch TV. I get anxious when there's crowds. And it seems ridiculous because, first of all, they're on TV, and second of all, it was filmed in the 70s, so whatever. But I watch my own anxiety get triggered, and I realize that that's what's happening with all of us right now. And that's going to lead more than we'd like it to as we look at coming back together.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely. I think, and I think that's one of the reasons why when I talked to Victor about this is, we've got Mental Health Month coming up in May, but are originally reaching out with it, but that there is this sense of anxiety and fear, and I think Ezra starts to get at it. We're going to see some of it here now, and as we get into this about the people's return and what it's like, and so I'll just segue into this. They set up the altar on its foundation because they were in dread of the neighboring peoples, and they offered burnt offerings upon it to the Lord morning and evening. And the commentators said, most strikingly of all, however, is the writer's insistence that the returnees' first recorded response to their fear of peoples was to prepare for and recommence their worship of God. And then prophecies around this time, you can see the Hagar reference, were keen to prescribe cultic restoration as a reassurance of God's presence and an antidote to anxiety, which is really, I thought that was a profound comment and really captured what was the emotion of these people returning in Ezra, the Judeans coming back. And I think for us, as Michelle pointed out, and the questions that I think what we can do for our people is how have they expressed their fears as a congregation, as a people, as individuals, and then how can you use the restoration of worship as a sign of God's reassuring presence? And the tying together, I thought it was beautiful that the return was that tying together of the emotions, that God's presence and the acknowledgement of the fears that they had were allowed an output. So here's my questions are for you is how have you been able to at this point allow your people to express their fears? So I think it'd be helpful for all of us to hear that. And then just thinking a thought process of how can we use restoration of worship as a reassuring sign of God's presence?
One of the tools that we used at St. Barnabas in Irvington was the survey. short surveys to gauge where people were in terms of their willingness to come back, and then putting together a palette of worship options that would sort of speak to those findings. And the biggest innovation has been not only, of course, the live streaming, but now moving worship out of doors. So having the 10 o'clock service in the sanctuary, and then immediately, in our case, going outside and having an 11 o'clock, simply to encourage people to get their church going legs back under them,
Right.
to meet those kind of fears of congregating indoors by having a service at 11 outside. That's been part of that response. And then second of all, I'm really intrigued by what emotions God is feeling, and what emotions should we be, in light of this wonderful question, what should we be saying about how God is feeling towards us in our anxiety? And, for me, it comes back to the notion that God is deeply appreciative and grateful for everything we've done. Perhaps that is the emotional range in which we're inviting people to bring their own emotions. Even if there isn't a direct correlation, there doesn't need to be. But the emotions of gratitude for the return, I suppose, would be. I'm just reframing it now for myself in light of what you're asking.
Would it make, as a question to all of you to consider, is there a, and we don't have one, right? But is there a service of lament that for those that we weren't able to bury, for the lost days, for those that are now shut in, and just that kind of scope of releasing of the anxiety, the dread. Think of it, who are our neighboring peoples today? It's almost that we would dread. And boy, there's a lot of people, I think, that have that emotion, and it's legitimate. Mary, I think you're going to say something.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the neighboring peoples, because it was the elites who were sent into exile, and they came back and looked upon the people who were their fellow Israelites as foreigners. And like, who would that be now? I'm thinking about how, some of us have been able to be at home. That's actually a privilege. And then there's the people who never got to really stay home. They've been going out all this time. And so like the needs of those different groups, I think about my own needs to like learn how to wear pants again and comport myself in a different way than I have in front of a screen. But then there, people who've been working in grocery stores and the post office have really different needs. And I'm not sure exactly what to do with that, but it's something to think about.
Yeah, is there a lament by those who had to work through this, the whole, and be exposed, in the exposure zone, if you will? What lament would they have? And what emotions would they want to carry and feel that reassurance from God on there? It's interesting. Yeah, Victor.
Yes, and something that I've been kind of, in answering to this, express their fear. I very much personalize that question as in, how am I expressing my fear that I don't know how to do my job right now? Like my tendency right now is to go to whatever thing I was doing in 2019 and trying to find solutions there. And right now I'm facing something completely different. I'm entering to this unknown territory that is scary, because there are things that I don't know how to face or how to interpret, how to live right now. My spiritual life as well being challenged in some ways as well. Like, how do I pray in exile? All of this is coming to reality right now. And that sense of restoration is one of my fears is that because of exactly that, we may rush into just get over it, let's move in and rush into without taking the time to stop and think and pray and reflect. And I see this pandemic as a kairos, moment where we have been shown so many things, and some of them are painful, and some of them are the human aspect of people together. Like all of these have been a moment of seeing something, but I see myself in all of this. Like, how do I do this right now? And without kind of being aware of the temptation to rush, like just get over it and let's move together again, do things in the way that we were doing in 2019, and just moving on because of my own anxiety in all of this as well.
I really appreciate the way you put that, Victor, because as we know, we're now under the Kairos gun again, as we're expected to sort of figure out what's going to happen in the fall and begin to show ourselves as clergy who are on top of it, who know what we're doing, who are articulating the plan and so on and so forth. So it's really brilliant that the way you put that, because we need permission, don't we, just to kind of unpack the Kairos moment without feeling too much pressure from the chronological piece.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'd like to add something, going back, as you said we could,
Yes.
that first question, which is, how have you seen God at work in surprising ways recently? And one of the huge things, which I sort of saw right away, but then forgot about, was my incredible concern about climate change and about all the traffic and all this stuff. And it's like God had a time out, for our planet, and just said, okay, everybody stop travel, stop, spewing all that poison into the air. And in many places, it's made a huge difference. And I guess part of my fear going back is that we're just going to go right back into it and not listen to the people who are telling us we're killing the planet. But it's been a gift to stop.
Yeah, that's good. Awesome. Any other thoughts before we're just going to essentially roll right through to this next verse in chapter 3, or two verses in chapter 3, which speak, I think, and carry forward what we're talking about. But many of the priests and Levites and heads of family, old people who had seen the first house on its foundations, wept with a loud voice when they saw this house, though many shouted aloud for joy, so that the people could not distinguish the sound of the joyful from the sound of the people's weeping. For the people shouted so loudly that the sound was heard far away. The commentary is the writer's curious insistence on emphasizing the impossibility of differentiating the sound between joy and sadness suggests that the point is less about the particular emotion expressed, interesting, than the intensity and the volume of expression and their testimony to those beyond the community. And here's the writer inserting fingerprints of their tradition. It's here, but regardless, I think the exegesis here of the noting that the sound was the sound of the emotion was all together is really interesting, and that it was so loud that it projected out into the wider community. It creates interesting thoughts for us, doesn't it? I mean, we can see what value can we see in giving purposeful space for an emotional response to returning. That's my first question for you all. And then, in what ways can your people's expression be a testimony for your parish's community, for the town you live in and serve in?
Well, I'd just like to say, coming from the background of a musician and an organist, I've spoken at many American Guild of Organists functions, and I often use this passage because the organists are always dealing with playing through the grief and the joy of a community in their hymn playing and choice of anthems. And to just recognize the fact that people can be in very different places at the same time. And I think that's the gift of this passage, that we're all going to be in a different place. We're not going to be feeling necessarily the same emotions, and that's okay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly, Victoria. I wonder, how we can give space to this, and in terms of, and I say that space in terms of what our emotions are allowed. What are the safe emotions to be expressed in community, or can we allow them all? As Episcopalians, we careful on some emotions that we want to express, but can we really let our people express a range of emotions and be that, not us, but the church, be a safe container for all sorts of emotions?
It makes me wonder whether, when we do finally get back into the room together, whether it's possible to have small group settings for people to reflect on their experience of what it was like for them during the lockdown and the time away, and what it's like for them as they return and re-engage, to be intentional about that. And I'm sure it can be done on Zoom, but as we know, the emotional resonance on Zoom is a little bit like listening to music that's been compressed. You don't get the full resonance of how people feel because you're not there in the room with them. So I wonder whether maybe there's room for small group process once we're all back in the room, so to speak.
Right. And then there's a question of, when we think of shouts are dangerous right now, right? Because that's almost like singing, which is dangerous right now. And so we've got layers of emotional responses that and layers of time until we see kind of a full range of emotions, don't we?
Perhaps that's reflected on a diocesan level by the churches that are hanging on financially by their fingernails right now, and we don't know whether we're going to make it through. Yeah. There are some parishes that have a systemic anxiety because of what the pandemic has done to them in financial terms or in other ways.
Yeah, and the other aspect is people were joyful to see the new temple, but they were also sad that it wasn't as big and glorious as the first temple. Mm-hmm. And so people will have the same feeling about coming back into church. Oh, there's no singing, there's no cup. It's great to be back, but it's not the same.
Right.
Yeah, the passage from Ezra strikes me as a expression of historical and generational trauma,
mm-hmm.
Which is exactly what we're going through with
mm-hmm.
the pandemic. That even a generation later, if I'm remembering my Old Testament history right, they've returned, but with a memory that temple was glorious and it was destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
And so some are still grieving that, while others are rejoicing that we have a toehold again. And that's really true for all of us. We all cope with the trauma of this pandemic in different ways. And we're going to see that, of course, in our congregation members. Somebody's already mentioned creating the safe space. That leans on us to create that safe mm-hmm. container for all of this emotion, from relief that I can at least come to church, see people across the aisle, wave a sign of peace, receive the host, to a sense of utter panic at coming out of the house for the first time, and everything in between. And part of that is, of course, our posture and stance and all of those nonverbals that are part of communicating and being communicators. Part of it is the explicit acknowledgement of our own feelings and what's the word I'm groping for? Stepping out in front of the congregation again, live and in person, and you know, thereby giving permission to feel and express and that kind of stuff. I've also seen with my congregation folks who were overwhelmed with a sense of relief that I've been away from my church, my best friends, my spiritual home for a year. And now finally being vaccinated and masked, I feel safe coming back. And no, it's not the same. And I remember one congregant in particular, it's not the same, but I am so glad to be here. And when it is finally the same again, it'll be another sense of relief. And this is, you know, with the mask over her face and the tears coming down her eyes. And we're all going to be in all those different places on a massive continuum of trauma and recovery. And I guess what I'm finding in myself is this need to make a renewed commitment to being the example of safe space and safe container and modeling that for that gathering congregation.
Nice.
And Bob, and I think something that talk about a time to be the church, you know, like and this is the time to be the church, you know, like this is the time where we can offer space for ourselves, for our communities to express what the trauma, you know, like to go through all of this and being vulnerable, being open and to be with people where they are, you know, like it's something that I think it's the sign of the times, you know, to have a space. And we do have physical spaces right now where we can create something for people to join and to express and to do something with this grief, with this trauma that we are experiencing. And Bob, you have been, I think, a pioneer in this sense, in the way that you have been communicating that to us in the church and say, you know, don't forget who you are. Don't forget who you are, because this is when we need you to be the church. And for our communities, that space that is needed as well at this moment, the space for being able to express grief and change and all that. And we are not going to be the same. That's the reality. And then coming to terms with that is the other transition that we need to be mentally and spiritually. You know, how do we live in this place where we are at this moment as well?
Right. I think thank you, Victor. You know, there's a lot of rich theology here that we can plumb the depth of. You know, we're not going to be the same, but is God the same? And how do we express that to not just our community, but to the wider church? Could that be something there? Let's move on to chapter. Let me get control here. There we go. Chapter 4. So and again, you all are really good about you're picking up on where this story is going. And so here we have in verse 4. When the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the returned exiles were building a temple to the Lord, the God of Israel, they approached Zerubbabel and the heads of the family and said to them, "Let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do, and we have been sacrificing to him ever since the days of King Esarhaddon of Syria, who brought us here." And here we see this conflict that arises. The basis of their offering is neither ethnicity or politically, but religious solidarity, for their claim is couched in the terms that seem plausible, right? Seeking God and sacrificing to him. And so I think as we see people return over the next year, some are going to be, as we've noted, some are going to be excited about coming back. Some are going to be fearful to be near others. Some are going to be quietly observing all that's happening and then deciding to stay or to leave. And so my question for you, and the question for us to discuss, because I think this is helpful, is how can your parish anticipate those responses, those various responses from that people may have? I would say Trevor, I know Trevor was going to add something. I'm wondering if Trevor, if you write in the chat, we'll pick it up and we can, if that's easy enough, if it's not so much to type. Yeah, go ahead, Tori. Yeah.
Hi. One of the ways that I'm going to say something that I imagine is obvious. We can just keep things. We can keep holding things that we're doing now as we move forward. I hesitate to go into that too much, because one of the things I've been thinking about is what do we want to take forward? What do we want to leave set down? What are we happy that we don't have to pick up again? But I do think, for instance, very, very technically, maintaining online worship along with in-person worship is one of the things that we've been talking about, so that those who are away, as we've been noting, who have moved away or can't come, can still be connected, to allow for the variety of engagement that I think that we can hold with in person, if we have those technical abilities, but holding as many ways to connect so that people can, in a gentle way, feel their way to reconnecting in person, because of course we have been connecting. And that's one of the things that I think we've all been saying, we are connected. Here's the body of Christ. Even though we're not with each other, we're connected. So just maintaining as many ways to do that as possible. And it makes me think about coffee hour, which brings me personally huge anxiety, because that is one of our small groups. That's we've got it built in, but do we now? What does that look like? And so I'll stop there.
Yeah. Trevor, did you want? I think you were trying to add something. Oh, I can't hear you.
Yeah.
Oh, there you are.
No, that's me.
Oh, that's you, Victor. Okay, Trevor.
Yeah, Trevor, I think is having some problems with the audio. So something that is been thinking about this and in praying with this as well is that most of our congregations are going to our tendency is to go back to silos while we are doing this. I will survive. I will thrive. I will do this, and that part of doing this in community, doing it without this. What is? Let us build with you, for we worship your God as you do. The tendency that there will be some places where we are going to find challenges of vitality and viability, but doing that together and saying, like, how can we build this together, like the body of Christ, and continue building this together, and thinking in other ways that may be challenging and taking us to places where it will be hard to be, but inviting us to do this together. Because I think that's the call that we have kept on listening and hearing through this pandemic, is how can we do this in a way that is not just me, but we, in surviving as well and moving along. So yes, I think that's something that we will keep on hearing from people. How do we keep our beautiful church moving, and maybe thinking about the neighbor, or maybe not. and how can we build this together. That's, I think, important to hear.
It's one of the things that I'm sort of trying to wrap my head around is any sense of mission has always relied upon a group of people within the congregation looking outwards and forwarding particular outreach to the community. Well, we've lost a lot of momentum over the last year just in that one area where we haven't been engaged with the wider community for whatever reason. And that in and of itself is a challenge in terms of the vitality piece. So I think it's going to be a couple of years probably before we can rebuild that kind of momentum as people sort of get back into coming to church, before they can sort of begin to think about being mission oriented again. So I think we're probably in a longer process than we ever anticipated in terms of congregational development and vitality, Victor, as you so well put it. So the time frame is going to be different to the one we think we're dealing with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I want to point out what Trevor has in the chat, a really nice comment here. As a part of staying connected and dealing with the emotional toll, we in his church have turned their coffee hour into a time of intentional conversation. That's really good use there, kind of framing out, making sure that people are checked in and have their emotions or just whatever they need to share is set up. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Trevor. Go ahead, Gareth.
We were doing coffee hour over Zoom, and we had quite a lot of people at first, and then the numbers dwindled down. And I was trying to figure out why that was. And I think it's because it's very hard, if you are the parish priest, to be orchestrating the voices at coffee hour and legislating how long people can talk for and so on. And I know that some parishes have been sophisticated because they've had chat rooms and breakout rooms for coffee hour, but we never got that far. We were not evolved enough in our thinking before we kind of lost people.
Right.
Because they felt that in coffee hour, you wander away from a group if you're not enjoying the conversation. Over Zoom, it was a kind of different, very different animal to kind of handle coffee hour. It's just difficult.
Yeah. Interesting challenge, right?
Yeah.
Well, let's I want to be cognizant of time a little bit here as well, just so we make sure we get moved on. And there we go. All right. That's my title here. So, once we get to chapter 4 in Ezra, we see disagreements and immobilization. There was a group of people, the people that had remained, those adversaries, as they were called by Ezra, and they petitioned kings back in Babylon to say, "Hey, wait a minute! You gotta be careful. We can't trust the people that are in the doing this rebuild." So as it says here, now it may be known to the king that if the city is rebuilt and the wall is finished, they will not pay tribute, custom, or toll, and the royal revenue will be reduced. And the comment here, it's a little lengthy, but it's worth pointing out. The community and its building activities are immobilized by intimidation long before the official order to cease and desist. At such moments, the community is in need of the reminder of David to Solomon when the latter was about to embark upon his building of the very temple the returnees are seeking to replace, where it says, quote, "Be strong and of good courage and act. Do not be afraid or dismayed, for Yahweh, my God, is with you. He will not fail to you or forsake you until all the service of the house of Yahweh is finished." People may become frightened again of the virus or by the virus, and some may look to external information or guidance to change church practices. And how do we as church leaders remain focused on God's reassuring presence, not to become immobilized, right? This is, and the acknowledgement, I think, from our end is that, hey, listen, we can become immobilized. We're just as human as everybody else, and we're just as fearful of gatherings and all of it. But it's interesting. So what I'm kind of thinking is, wow, when do we have that moment in time where somebody says, well, the CDC said, or Governor Cuomo said, or the county executive said, or the mayor has said, or my cousin has said, and therefore what you're doing is wrong. Or my friend who's a doctor says, you shouldn't be doing this. And there's that, we're going to run, we possibly, right? I mean, all our congregations are so healthy and well, and they won't do this to us, right? But there may be that one or two people that say, but what you're doing is putting us all at risk. And how do we not become immobilized?
I think suddenly even putting the virus a bit aside, I think something that may immobilize some of us is that we won't recognize the church and say, what is this thing online? And if everyone is supposed to be back to the building, and that fear of change. And even though we have gone through this moment, still many conversations is that mentality of going back. When are we going back to normal? And that kind of transition will immobilize some of us, because we are going to be afraid to lose parishioners. We are going to be afraid to lose members who are pledging members in our communities. We are going to be afraid to engage in different conversations with them because of that fear and mobilizing us and say, can we dare to do this in a different way? And that reassuring presence of God in the midst of all of these changes, say God is with us, the Emmanuel, God is with us. But again, it that transition that I think we'll need to, because the virus will be definitely one element, maybe something recurring as we move into the fall, maybe winter again, something reappearing. But internally, that transition that is not recognizing the churches, not recognizing my congregation, not recognizing those ones who are there.
Right.
And that definition of who is a member and who is not a member, coming back again to play a central role in defining who we are as a church. Okay.
And I think you point out something interesting, right? Immobilization may not be to stop everything. Immobilization might be saying, no, we have to do everything the way we used to do it. That could be, mobilization could also exist within some action, right? So it's not just a complete cessation, right? And immobilization may be something, as it said, as the commentator noted. Well, the immobilization happened long before they were told they were supposed to be immobilized. So there's this kind of self-reflection of what is immobilization as we begin to progress within church. And these are things that we can wrestle with. I don't think we have a clear nor one answer to it.
I also think some people need a chaplain, and some people are looking for strong clergy leadership, and you have to adapt according to the needs of the particular parishioner or congregant, because some people want the reassurance on a one-to-one that all things will be well, and some are saying unless we move forward, we've got to regain some momentum and so on and so forth, and that involves change and adaptivity. So I think that we wear two hats very often, given the demographics of our congregations.
Yeah, that will be.
And Gareth, I think you're pointing out to something that is one of my fears is that we as clergy, we are going to be depleted. We're going to enter into a moment where we won't be having time to heal and to recuperate and to acknowledge some of these that have been going through. And then we're jumping into responding to all of these different scenarios that we are going to face, that we are already facing in so many ways, and how to be present among all of that. And that talk about immobilizing, even moving into that, how do we respond to all of that? It's scary, it's right now is I see many of us reaching the limit and say, when am I going to have a moment to rest, or even to acknowledge that I'm going through this, and a moment to take a boat and just go into the lake and just not be connected to anyone, just being there in that lake.
Yeah. I think Trevor brings up a really interesting layered comment and question. He writes, I'm about to install cameras in the church for live broadcasting, but some don't want to be seen on live view. It's a challenge that has created some conversations as to legal issues. How can we do this without incurring some legal trauma? I think that one is, I think if you have some thoughts directly, let's engage that conversation. But also let's keep in mind what we can, Trevor may want to have some private conversation as well. So have that be, I hope one of you or several of you are willing to do that with him. But let's kick this around for a minute. I think this is a really interesting question, right?
Yeah, I think in the big picture, it's really important that we begin these conversations now, if we're not already in them with the lay leadership and congregants who engage in that kind of stuff, because it's not going to look the way it always did, no matter how we try to put it back. There will be some people who will always wear a mask to church from here on out. Even when we're finally free to go back to communion from the cup, some will never feel safe doing that again. And we have to create space for that conversation to happen. I haven't yet had anybody raise an issue about being on camera, but I certainly understand that. Some people are very, very nervous about what goes out over the internet. And, that again, that's one of those conversations that probably has to roll for a while before there's going to be a sense of where the community settles. Yeah. We have been talking about getting a permanent camera and mounting it. That's just an expense we're not looking at right now because we've got other things to deal with in the forefront. But yeah, I think it's a crucial conversation. I'll back up now.
Yeah. My suggestion from my experience as an interim and the leadership studies that I did in my doctoral program is try the language of experiment. In other words, we're going to put the camera in, we're going to try it out for a time, we're going to see how it feels. Let's give it a go. We don't, it's not permanent. We can do it for a while, and to test it out so people can kind of feel that, oh, thank God, it's not, I can, as opposed to saying, and this is it, it's done, live with it, is maybe too much emotionally now for people to handle. Whereas 2 years ago, people would be like, camera, who cares? You know what? I didn't even know it was there. And so it is that sense of experimentation. I think it can buy you some space that could be really helpful these days. Oops, went back too far. Let me see. Let me try this again. There we go. Yep. So this is about the goods of returning, and goods in the sense of ethical sense of, what were the things that happened that were for the better, right? They finished the building by command of God of Israel and by decree of Cyrus, right? Darius and King Artaxerxes of Persia. And the house was finished on the 3rd day of the month of Adar in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius. And it's interesting, right, that the date of completion was carefully noted, so they could really drill into that. And I think the question that I would have for you is if we think of it's important, how can we note for prosperity your church's restoration, full restoration, whatever? And I use restoration as not a return to normal, but just a restoration of the presence of God and ourselves worshiping. So kind of think of that as a wider view. And then I would add, say, and I think we've talked about some of these already, but what are the silver linings that may have emerged from the pandemic for you all?
Father Bob, you just helped me make a connection between the restoration of the congregation and the building. So we're putting in a new HVAC system and HEPA filters and so on to encourage people to come back. And so I hadn't really figured out that the restoration and the renew of mechanicals and so on that we're doing right now, it's all to help the congregation feel comfortable in the building, but ultimately it's about their restoration. And I hadn't seen that until you just pointed that out, that the temple was a symbol of the people truly being back from exile.
Right.
And obviously anything we can do to improve our buildings while people are out, getting some work done, doing something. We're building a welcome center in what was the old baptistry, so that when they come in, there'll be a little welcome center, and we're sort of being intentional about that project. But I thought of it's also to make a little wow factor. Wow, this is new.
Yeah.
And we've done this for you because we want you to be oriented back into the sanctuary for new people coming in and so on. So I love that concept of restoration is so resonant, isn't it, with all aspects of congregational life.
And to be restored, not to be healthy, not just to be restored in relationship wherever we are, right? I would look at it from that point of view. And it's about our return to normal, but a restoring of our relationship through the community worship in a building that we deem as holy, and how to do that.
There's something to say about welcoming back, in the sense that we need to, like, sometimes when we have newcomers, we have like, oh, let's have this section where we present the church to them, and I think this is a time where we need to reintroduce that concept again and say, how do we welcome back people into this space, and how then understand that they are back into this space. And there's that physical experience, but I was thinking as well of kind of a liturgical experience, for example, with the renewal of the baptismal vows, for example, like helping people understand that this is who we are as a community. And how do we do this together? Maybe dedicating a month to do that, and praying together every time the baptismal vows, like how do we, this is who we are, and reaffirming that. We have beautiful liturgy in our Book of Common Prayer, the reaffirmation, for example, that we have there. How do we reaffirm again who we are as a community of faith now in this new way that we are, and being intentional about this, being intentional and saying this is something that we are going to do. This is helping them find themselves and find ourselves in this space again, in this space.
One person that I was speaking to recently, one of our colleagues said that, remarked that the one thing that the church will have, that one of the demarcations, some of the challenges that we face are the church, church people and secular people kind of look and act the same most of the time, right? We go to the store, we do this, we do, a lot of things are very similar. But how do we, coming out of the pandemic, one of the things that we'll see of our congregations will be stronger in their mental health than a lot of our neighbors, because of the community aspect of being able to gather on a weekly or even daily basis now in worship of God. And in doing so, I think yes, there's going to be that mental health issues that we're going to have, and it's going to feel real and raw for us. But compared to the wider fears of the community, it can be really is in some ways a silver lining to show the distinction of what we have and what we gain in our worship of God and trust of God, compared to those that have said, I'm going to my ultimate being is just myself. And how is that fair versus having our ultimate concern is God?
I want to thank you. You all are blessing me so much. God has been, I realize now, listening to this conversation, been setting me up. We have some baptisms that, not my design, actually anti my design, are going to be weeks before we're all coming back in together. And I realize what a gift I'm being offered that I hadn't connected until listening to you. So I just want to say thank you, to be able to use the baptisms as a way to reaffirm our restoration as new and complex, and adding new people, and that's great, but we don't even know them. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Dory. Thanks for sharing that. That's such an encouragement.
Wow.
Well, we are, Vic, go ahead. I'll let you comment.
Thank you. I'll be quick. I hadn't made the connection until you mentioned it, Garth, that you're doing some construction projects over there. But now that the conversation has come around to this, I'm making this connection. One of the things we've suffered from over several years now is that our disability access had fallen out from under us. We had a mechanical lift that would bring people from street level up to the level of the church, and it has broken down a few years ago. And we've been raising money and trying to get into a permanent wheelchair ramp instead. Now, during pandemic, by God's grace, we are able to we can afford to begin that project and see it come to fruition. And listening to you guys, I realized this could easily become a symbol of that new birth after the pandemic. That not only are we back together, but we're moving forward in an accessibility direction that we've been frustrated on prior.
I'm going to use Trevor's comment in the chat as well. First, I think it's terrific, and how many as an interim, how many times I go through the church and go, first thing we have to do is clean the place, and get that kind of deep cleaning, and it just happens over time, right? And so I think, Trevor, that's awesome that the place is more clean, physically clean, that hasn't been in 20 years, right? And then the increased ministries to other persons. I think that's a beautiful thing. What I would here's my pitch that for the next time I will be with you all. I think we're set for Victor for May. So the topic will be on creating cleanliness, and we think about being the clean and unclean is so much a part of our real biblical experience. And so what the topics that we'll look at and kind of frame this out is spiritually, emotionally, physically, medically, and musically. How can we, these issues of clean and unclean, is my neighbor clean or unclean as respect to the virus or cold, or what, as a clergy person, if I'm not well, what's my obligation as a clean or unclean person ready for worship on a Sunday if they have a cold, God forbid if it's just a cold, right? And so that will be our May conversation that I invite you and others to back for. And so here's just as ways of conclusion from the commentary that I worked with is community building is the heart of the story of Ezra and Nehemiah. And I think that's the community building is going to be the heart of our work as clergy right now. The single narrative of both books portrays the restoration and reformation of God's covenant community in its ideals and its continuing fallibilities. I thought that was a good way. And I think we've seen some of that no, neighbors, we don't need your help. I know you worship the same God as us. We got this. Those kind of things we saw in the book of Ezra this morning. The returning exiles knew precisely who they were, which is really, I think, an interesting lesson for us to bring as we're restoring, that we know who we are. So although they had lived out of the land for 2 generations, we've been out of our buildings for a year, right? So that only the very oldest had a memory of the original temple. They still know where and to whom they belonged. And so they were able to claim authentic membership as in the restored people of God. I think that's at the hallmark of what Ezra can be for us, is that remembering, as I would say in my stewardship sermons, whose we are. And in terms of that, whose are we as we return, and not just whose building is this, right? But whose are we as God, as God's children, as God's people. So with that, I know we're right up against time, so I want to be respectful of that. Thank you, everybody, so much. I will put a plug in for my most recent book, Courage to Thrive. Could be helpful for some folks. It's got 40 spiritual reflections that are all dealing with mental health challenges. If that's something of interest to you, Amazon has it. My website has it, and my website's robertdflanagan.com. And then, I'm available. I do guest preaching, particularly now that I'm not doing an interim for a little bit. I'm working on a book here. I'm actually at Virginia Seminary working at doing the research. So I'll be back in the rest of 21. I'll be available for these kinds of things, and there are things I've done, and it would be in a similar kind of format as you've received today. So happy to do that. Teaching at General this fall, a congregational spiritual direction, which has been an interesting class to teach, and through the Virginia Seminary, we'll be doing a lifelong learning program, shortened 6 weeks, no homework or no papers, that will cover the same topics. So you can be on the lookout for this too. So thank you, Victor, for the time. I really appreciated being able to do this. And don't we have what date is we have the lay people?
We have now, thank you, Bob. And yes, we have our next session will be on the 29th from 6 p.m. to 7:30 p.m. And again, it's mainly for lay leaders, but then everyone as well, like clergy are welcome. We have a lot of deacons attending this session as well. So that's a blessing always. So, but if you have your lay leaders, this is something that it would be great for them to be engaged with as well. And
same topic
yes,
we've done this morning. So
yes.
Again.
And Bob, I think something that, thank you for sharing with us your gifts, and you're truly a blessing for us at this moment. And these have been really timely as we are walking into these new realities that we are facing, and giving us so much. So thank you for that, and for being so available to us as well. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Okay.
Right.
Thanks everyone, and continue to have a blessed rest of the day as well.
Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. God bless.
Thank you.